had sleep apnea when I was just a baby.
She thought she was the sickest little girl in the world.
Then it graduated to a seizure disorder, muscular dystrophy, to leukemia.
But it was all a lie.
She controlled everything in my life.
Made up by her cruel mother.
She was particularly manipulative.
So Gypsy Rose took drastic action.
Whose plan was it to kill your mother?
It was my plan.
In June of 2015, a single Facebook post sent shockwaves across the internet. It appeared on the account of a quiet young woman few people truly knew, and it contained a message so violent that police were alerted within hours. What investigators discovered next would unravel a story far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. At the center of it all was Gypsy Rose Blanchard, a young woman the public believed was terminally ill, confined to a wheelchair, and dependent on her mother for survival. For years, she had been the face of sympathy, charity, and community support. But behind that carefully constructed image was a life defined not by sickness, but by control. When Gypsy's mother, D.D. Blanchard, was found brutally murdered in their home, Gypsy was no longer seen as a fragile victim. Instead, she became a suspect. And as the investigation unfolded, the narrative split in two. One side seeing a calculated killing, the other seeing a lifetime of abuse that left no clear path to escape. This case forces an uncomfortable reckoning. It blurs the line between victim and accomplice, between survival and premeditation. Lies told to doctors, neighbors, and authorities began to surface, alongside evidence of manipulation, isolation, and psychological imprisonment that started in childhood and never truly ended. What followed was not just a murder investigation, but a public debate that continues to divide opinion to this day. Was this a cold-blooded murder, or the desperate result of lifelong abuse? Tell us in the comments. For years, the world believed it knew exactly who Gypsy Rose was. She was introduced as a gravely ill child, suffering from a long list of medical conditions: leukemia, muscular dystrophy, severe asthma, epilepsy, and cognitive delays. According to medical records presented by her mother, Gypsy's body was fragile, her immune system compromised, and her life expectancy uncertain. Doctors were told she could not walk, that she needed round-the-clock care, that she would never live independently. And so, Gypsy appeared in public exactly as expected. She was almost always seen in a wheelchair, her legs thin and seemingly lifeless beneath a blanket. A feeding tube protruded from her abdomen, delivering nutrition she was said to be unable to swallow on her own. Her head was regularly shaved, reinforcing the image of a child battling cancer treatments. To anyone looking in from the outside, her physical appearance seemed to confirm every diagnosis. Standing beside her was her mother, D.D., attentive, soft-spoken, and unwaveringly devoted. D.D. presented herself as a tireless caregiver, a single mother who had sacrificed everything to keep her sick child alive. She spoke for Gypsy in public, answered questions on her behalf, and carefully managed every interaction with doctors, neighbors, and charitable organizations. The story they told was compelling, and people believed it. Charities stepped in to help. Donations poured in. The family received free trips, financial assistance, and eventually a newly built wheelchair-accessible home through a housing charity. Local media featured Gypsy as an inspiration, a brave child smiling through unimaginable suffering. Neighbors dropped off gifts. Churches prayed for her. Strangers wept for a girl they had never met. In that community, Gypsy and Dee were not questioned. They were protected. Few people noticed that Gypsy's age seemed to change, depending on the paperwork. Fewer questioned why medical records were always incomplete or missing. When inconsistencies appeared, Dee Dee explained them away. Lost documents after Hurricane Katrina, forgetful doctors, clerical errors. Her confidence and apparent devotion disarmed suspicion before it could fully form, and Gypsy herself rarely contradicted the story. When spoken to directly, she often stayed quiet, avoided eye contact, or deferred to her mother. When she did speak, her voice was soft and childlike, reinforcing the belief that she was far younger and more cognitively impaired than she truly was. To the outside world, there was no reason to doubt what they were seeing. A sick child, a loving mother, a tragic but inspiring story. But beneath the wheelchair, the feeding tube, and the shaved head was a reality no one was allowed to see, a reality that would only come to light after blood had already been spilled. Do you think the warning signs were there, or was this deception impossible to catch? Tell us in the comments. To understand how this story reached such a violent end, it's necessary to look closely at the person who controlled every aspect of Gypsy's world. Dee Dee. To neighbors and doctors, Dee Dee appeared attentive and fiercely protective, a mother who never left her child's side. But behind closed doors, that devotion took on a far darker form. Dee Dee was not simply caring for Gypsy, she was managing her, shaping her reality through fear, deception, and absolute control. From a young age, Dee Dee insisted that Gypsy Rose was seriously ill. She kept binders of medical paperwork, often disorganized or incomplete, and moved frequently enough that doctors rarely had a full picture of Gypsy's history. When questions were raised, Dee Dee redirected them, blaming lost records, previous physicians, or emergencies that made verification difficult. Over time, the medical narrative became more extreme. Procedures were approved, medications were prescribed, surgeries were performed. Gypsy was given drugs for conditions she did not have, some of which caused real side effects: fatigue, weakness, and dental damage. Her teeth eventually decayed and were removed, reinforcing the illusion that her body was failing. Inside the home, Dee Dee's control intensified. Gypsy was rarely allowed to leave alone. She was homeschooled, limiting outside influence. Phone calls were monitored. Conversations with neighbors were supervised. Dee Dee often spoke for Gypsy, correcting her if she answered questions wrong, or stepping in if she said too much. Gypsy learned quickly that silence was safer. When Gypsy questioned her illnesses or tried to assert independence, punishment followed. According to later accounts, Dee Dee used threats and physical restraint to maintain obedience. Gypsy was sometimes tied to the bed. At other times, she was told that if she disobeyed, her mother would smash her fingers with a hammer or report her as mentally incompetent to authorities. Perhaps most disturbing was Dee Dee's control over Gypsy's identity itself. Gypsy was told she was years younger than her actual age. Her birth date changed depending on the situation. Legal documents conflicted. Even Gypsy was unsure how old she truly was for much of her life. Without a stable sense of age, education, or independence, she remained trapped in a permanent state of childhood, emotionally, legally, and socially. Dee Dee controlled what Gypsy ate, when she slept, how she dressed, and how she presented herself to the world. Illness became not just a story, but a rule book, and obedience became a condition for survival. From the outside, it looked like protection. From the inside, it was something else entirely. In your opinion, was Gypsy more trapped by physical control or psychological fear? Tell us in the comments. By the time Gypsy Rose reached her teenage years, the damage went far beyond doctors' offices and medical charts. What Dee Dee had built around her daughter was not just a false medical reality, but a psychological cage, one that shaped how Gypsy thought, felt, and understood the world. Gypsy received little formal education, She was homeschooled in name, but in practice, learning was inconsistent and controlled. Basic skills were delayed. Independent thinking was discouraged. Dee positioned herself as the sole source of truth, information, and decision-making in Gypsy's life. Without school, peers, or trusted adults, Gypsy had no way to compare her reality to anyone else's. Social contact was equally restricted. Friendships were rare and closely monitored. Conversations with neighbors happened under Dee's watchful eye. Gypsy was taught that outsiders were dangerous, that doctors, police, or social workers would take her away if she spoke out, or that she would be punished for lying about her illnesses. Over time, fear replaced curiosity. This fear wasn't accidental, it was conditioned. Gypsy learned that questioning her mother led to consequences. Disobedience meant isolation. Resistance meant punishment. According to later testimony, Dee used physical restraint, verbal threats, and emotional manipulation to enforce compliance. Gypsy was reminded repeatedly that she was weak, incapable, and dependent, that without her mother she would die. Even moments of rebellion were quickly crushed. When Gypsy attempted to assert independence or imagined a different life, Dee responded with control, not comfort. Hope became dangerous. Desire became something to hide. Perhaps most paralyzing was the uncertainty Gypsy lived with every day. She didn't know her true age. She didn't know which diagnoses were real. She didn't know what her body was actually capable of. And because she had been raised to believe she was fragile and cognitively impaired, the idea of surviving on her own felt impossible. Escape wasn't just physically difficult, it was psychologically unthinkable. Where could she go if she couldn't walk? Who would believe her over her mother? How could she survive when she had been taught she couldn't even care for herself? Dee didn't need locked doors or chains. The fear, dependence, and confusion did that work for her. And in that kind of environment, childhood never ends. It simply turns into captivity. Do you think growing up under this kind of control permanently changes a person's ability to make choices later in life? Share your thoughts with us. For most of her life, Gypsy had no private world of her own. Every movement was watched. Every conversation was filtered. Every thought that challenged her mother's authority was punished. But quietly, and almost by accident, that began to change. Sometime in her late teens, Gypsy gained limited access to the internet, first through shared computers, later through secret devices she hid from her mother. Online, there were no wheelchairs, no feeding tubes, no medical charts. For the first time, Gypsy could speak without being corrected, monitored, or silenced. She created profiles under different names. She explored chat rooms and social media. She experimented with fantasy personas, versions of herself that could walk, date, flirt, and imagine a future beyond the walls of her home. These online identities weren't just games. They were rehearsals for a life she had never been allowed to live. Through these spaces, Gypsy began forming relationships, friendships that felt real precisely because they were hidden. People listened to her, they believed her. And unlike the adults in her real life, they didn't immediately side with her mother. Eventually, Gypsy met Nick Godejohn. Nick was socially isolated, spending much of his time online. Their conversations quickly became intense and emotionally charged. Gypsy shared pieces of her life, first carefully, then completely. She spoke about her illnesses, her confinement, and later the abuse. Nick responded with validation, affection, and a growing sense of protectiveness. What began as a conversation turned into dependency. Nick became someone Gypsy could lean on emotionally, someone who didn't see her as a patient or a child. To Gypsy, he represented escape, not just from her mother, but from the identity that had been forced onto her since birth. Their relationship deepened, blending romance, fantasy, and desperation in ways neither fully understood. But this wasn't a relationship forming in reality. It was developing in isolation, fueled by secrecy, trauma, and unmet needs. And as their bond grew stronger, the idea of simply running away began to feel less realistic, and more dangerous alternatives started to take shape. For Gypsy Rose Blanchard, the idea of escape existed long before the idea of murder. She didn't dream of violence. She dreamed of leaving, of walking out the door, of living a life where every breath wasn't monitored, measured, or corrected by her mother. At one point, Gypsy tried to run away. She met a man at a convention and believed she could start over with him. But the attempt failed almost immediately. Dee Dee found her, dragged her back home, and the consequences were severe. According to Gypsy's later accounts, her mother smashed her laptop, threatened to report her as mentally incompetent, and physically restrained her for weeks. Any illusion of freedom was replaced with a clear message. Leaving was not an option. From that moment on, Dee Dee's control tightened. Gypsy's movements were further restricted. Privacy vanished. Trust was replaced with surveillance. Dee Dee reinforced the idea that the outside world was dangerous and unforgiving, that Gypsy would be arrested, institutionalized, or killed if she tried to escape again. Fear wasn't just a byproduct of control anymore, it was the system itself. As Gypsy retreated inward, her online relationship with Nick Godejohn intensified. What began as emotional support turned into something heavier. Gypsy spoke openly about her failed escape attempt, about the punishments that followed, and about her belief that she would never be allowed to leave alive. At first, their conversations focused on running away together, but every scenario collapsed under the same reality. Dee Dee tracked Gypsy constantly. She controlled her money, her identification, and her medical narrative. Any attempt to leave would be discovered and punished. Slowly, the tone of their discussions changed. Instead of how to escape, the question became how to make escape possible. Instead of planning a future, they began talking about removing the obstacle standing in the way of it. The language shifted carefully at first, almost hypothetically, but repetition made the unthinkable feel discussable. Eventually, the line was crossed. Gypsy began to believe that her mother would never let her go, that the abuse would only end if Dee Dee was gone. And Nick, deeply emotionally attached and eager to be the one who saved her, began to see violence as an act of protection rather than destruction. Plans were no longer abstract. Details were discussed. Timing was considered. Money was sent. The idea of murder moved from conversation to coordination. This was the moment everything changed, when escape stopped being about running away and started being about ending a life. So tell us, at this point, do you think Gypsy still saw another way out, or had fear and control already narrowed her choices beyond repair? By June of 2015, the plans that had once felt distant and unreal were now set in motion. What had begun as secret conversations and imagined escape had narrowed into a single, irreversible night. In the days leading up to the crime, Gypsy Rose Blanchard helped prepare the details. She arranged for money to be sent. She confirmed when her mother would be asleep. She communicated constantly with Nick Godejohn, who traveled to Missouri specifically for what was about to happen. On the night of June 14th, Gypsy and her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard, went to bed as they always did. To the outside world, nothing about that evening appeared unusual. There were no signs of struggle beforehand, no warning to neighbors, no indication that this would be the final night inside that home. In the early hours of June 15th, Nick entered the house while Dee Dee slept. Gypsy waited in the bathroom, covering her ears. She later said she did not want to hear what was happening, but she also did not leave. she did not call for help. She remained in the home while the attack unfolded just feet away. Nick stabbed Dee Dee multiple times, killing her in her own bed. When it was over, Gypsy emerged. She helped clean parts of the scene. She and Nick gathered belongings, including money and personal items. The two then left the house together, checking into a motel before traveling by bus to Wisconsin. For the first time in her life, Gypsy was physically free, but the cost of that freedom had just been paid. What followed shocked investigators almost as much as the murder itself. From a motel room hundreds of miles away, posts appeared on Gypsy's Facebook account. One message was explicit, violent, and impossible to ignore. It prompted a welfare check that led police back to the Missouri home and to the discovery of Dee Dee's body. Within days, Gypsy and Nick were located and arrested. The truth unraveled quickly after that. The wheelchair, the illnesses, the years of deception, and the role Gypsy had played, not as a passive bystander but as an active participant in the events leading up to the killing. There was no going back. No version of escape that didn't include a body. When police arrived at the Blanchard home in Springfield, Missouri, they were not expecting to uncover a homicide rooted in years of deception. The call that brought them there was triggered by alarming messages posted online. Messages that suggested violence but offered no context. At first, investigators feared the worst for the person everyone believed was most vulnerable. Inside the house, they found Dee Dee Blanchard dead in her bed. The scene immediately raised red flags, but the concern quickly shifted to Gypsy. Her wheelchair was still in the home. Her medications were still there. There was no sign of forced entry. To the police, it looked like a brutal crime, followed by a kidnapping, or worse, a second murder waiting to be discovered. An Amber Alert was considered. Officers and volunteers began searching for Gypsy Rose Blanchard, convinced she had been abducted by someone dangerous. The assumption was simple. Gypsy could not walk, could not travel alone, and could not have survived on her own. But that assumption would collapse almost immediately. Using digital evidence from the Facebook posts and phone records, investigators traced communications to Nick Godejohn in Wisconsin. When police arrived at his home, they found both Nick and Gypsy together, alive, unharmed, and standing. Gypsy walked out to meet the officers. It was a moment that stunned investigators. The wheelchair, the feeding tube, the years of reported illness, none of it matched what they were seeing. As questioning began, the case took a dramatic turn. Gypsy spoke, and what she described wasn't a kidnapping, but a killing, one she admitted to helping plan. As details emerged, the focus of the investigation shifted again. Medical records were re-examined, doctors were contacted, neighbors were interviewed with new questions in mind. Slowly, the image of a devoted caregiver began to fracture, revealing inconsistencies that had gone unnoticed for years. Diagnoses couldn't be confirmed. Procedures seemed unnecessary. Ages didn't align. And the story of a terminally ill child began to unravel into something far more disturbing. Investigators were no longer dealing with a straightforward murder case. They were confronting a tangled web of abuse, manipulation, and institutional failure, one where the victim and the suspect were no longer easy to separate. So, here's the question for you. When investigators realized Gypsy wasn't the helpless child they'd been searching for, do you think it changed how justice should be applied, or should the crime itself outweigh everything that came before it? As the full scope of what happened inside the Blanchard home came into focus, the legal system faced a case unlike most it had seen before. What began as a homicide investigation had transformed into a debate about abuse, responsibility, and how the law should respond when victimhood and guilt overlap. Both Gypsy Rose Blanchard and Nick Godejohn were charged in the murder of Dee Dee Blanchard, but their paths through the justice system would look very different. Gypsy chose not to go to trial. In 2016, she accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to second-degree murder. Prosecutors acknowledged the years of documented abuse and medical manipulation she had endured, weighing that history against her role in planning the crime. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, a punishment that reflected both accountability and mitigation. For some, it felt appropriate. For others, it felt like either too much or not enough. Nick's case unfolded in a courtroom. During his trial, prosecutors painted him as the one who carried out the killing, the person who physically stabbed Dee Dee to death. The defense argued that he had been manipulated, emotionally dependent, and driven by a desire to protect Gypsy. Ultimately, the jury rejected that argument. Nick was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The contrast between their sentences ignited a public divide. Some saw Gypsy as a survivor who made an impossible choice after years of captivity. Others argued that planning a murder, regardless of motive, crossed a line that should carry the harshest consequences. The question of fairness became inseparable from the question of trauma. As the case gained national attention, media coverage exploded. Documentaries, dramatizations, interviews, and true crime series dissected every detail. Gypsy became a cultural symbol, to some of survival, to others of moral ambiguity. The story sparked conversations about Munchausen by proxy, failures in medical oversight, and how abuse can distort decision-making. But no amount of analysis could simplify what happened. One woman was dead. One young woman went to prison after a childhood of control. One man received a life sentence for acting on a plan born online, and the public was left deeply divided. I'm curious to know what you think. Do you believe the justice system struck the right balance between accountability and compassion, or does this case prove that some crimes defy any truly fair outcome? Please tell me in the comments. In the years following the conviction, the story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard did not fade quietly into the background. Instead, it continued to evolve, raising new questions long after the courtroom doors had closed. While serving her sentence, Gypsy began experiencing a life that had been denied to her for decades. In prison, she received consistent medical evaluations, many of which confirmed that the illnesses she had lived under for most of her life were never real. She learned basic independence, formed friendships, and spoke openly about the abuse she had endured. For the first time, her identity was not defined by sickness, but by accountability and survival.
Everyone, this is Gypsy. I'm finally free.
Free for a year? Mm-hmm. Do you feel like you have your footing finally?
There's still things I'm adjusting to. Literally, I went to get coffee and I went to an ATM and I realized I've never got money out of an ATM before, so it didn't work. I'm like, am I doing this right?
When Gypsy was released after serving her sentence, public attention reignited almost immediately. Some viewed her release as a long overdue second chance. Others questioned whether freedom could ever truly coexist with the role she played in a planned killing. The debate followed her into life outside prison, a reminder that public judgment doesn't end when a sentence does. Beyond Gypsy herself, the case left a lasting mark on public awareness. The term Munchausen by proxy entered mainstream conversation, forcing uncomfortable discussions about how abuse can hide behind medical authority and parental devotion. Doctors, social workers, and advocacy groups examined how warning signs were missed, how a child underwent years of unnecessary treatment without effective intervention. The failures were not limited to one person. Medical systems trusted incomplete records. Institutions failed to communicate. Neighbors assumed someone else would step in. Each layer of oversight passed responsibility along, until tragedy made it unavoidable. And even now, questions remain. Could earlier intervention have saved Dee Dee's life? Could Gypsy's choices have been different if someone had listened sooner? And how many similar situations go unnoticed because they don't end in murder? The story of Gypsy resists simple conclusions. It cannot be reduced to a single label, not hero, not monster, not innocent, not evil. It exists in the uneasy space between survival and responsibility, where clear answers are rare and moral certainty is impossible. Gypsy was abused, controlled, and deprived of a normal childhood. That reality is undeniable. But so is the fact that a life was deliberately taken. Dee Dee was an abuser, and she was also a victim of a violent death. Nick Godejohn acted out the final, irreversible act, and now lives with the consequences of it. This case forces us to confront questions that don't fit neatly inside courtrooms or headlines. How does lifelong abuse shape decision-making? Where does accountability begin when autonomy has been systematically stripped away? And can justice ever fully address harm that unfolds over decades? Behind the documentaries, debates, and viral opinions are real people, damaged, lost, and forever changed. A mother is dead. A daughter lost her childhood and years of her freedom. A man will spend his life behind bars. There are no clean endings here, only lessons, warnings, and unresolved discomfort. And perhaps that is the most honest way to remember this case. Not as a story with heroes or villains, but as a reminder of what happens when abuse goes unchecked and when intervention comes too late. After hearing the full story, the abuse, the planning, and the murder, how do you ultimately see Gypsy? Primarily as a victim of lifelong control, or as someone who must be held fully responsible for the choices she made? I'm in the comments waiting for your reply. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel.